1997, Sony released Oddworld: Abe's Odyssey for the PlayStation, and at the time it was considered a groundbreaking and revolutionary game for the story and concept of that particular game. The character of Abe was seen as one of the main characters, the most well-known characters of the mid to late 1990s in video gaming. The plot of the original game had Abe being that of a prisoner on the planet of Oddworld, his race being that of the Mudokons, and his people being considered and implemented as the new food source, the Paramite Pies and the Mudokon Pops. Abe happens to overhear of these corporate plans and later decides to escape. Almost dying in the process, he sees a vision from a shaman and is commanded to rescue his people. Through the plot of the story, Abe obtains powers to save his people, which he eventually does, and the concept for the game was considered original and unique in terms of story. But the game had some controversial aspects as well. The fact that Abe and his people were being used for food by another race had some detractors at the time, and some commentators thought that it was too dark for a video game story plot. The visual designs of the game, including that of Abe and his appearance, were radical and once again groundbreaking, as critics and commentators at the time called these designs somewhat gory and sadistic. Oddworld: Abe's Odyssey is also considered one of the most difficult video games ever conceived for the original Sony PlayStation, and the dynamics of Abe and his progression and achievements to be made through the game were considered extremely difficult. With the success of Abe's Odyssey, a sequel was made in 1998 called Abe's Exodus. Once again, Abe had to save his people, with the threat this time being that of the Soulstorm Brewery. Much like the first game, aspects of the plot and story were relatively dark for the time and received a lot of attention as a result. These two games are considered the original games of Abe and Oddworld. They were focused claims on more games to expand the Oddworld franchise, but there were no clear ways to move forward with the games. This would actually come back to haunt the franchise in later years. In 2001, Oddworld: Munch's Odyssey was developed and released exclusively for the Xbox. At the time, Microsoft did not have a lot of support for games on its new console, and developers were hesitant to put money and effort into a Microsoft console, let alone games for one. Deals were put in place to put the third Oddworld game onto the Xbox, and as a result of this exclusive arrangement, the lack of gamer support for the Xbox, Munch's Odyssey did not get much exposure. Later on, the game was re-released on multiple consoles, but results were mixed on the reception of the game and new focus for the Oddworld franchise. In 2005, Oddworld: Stranger's Wrath was released, and reactions from critics were positive, but gamers were divided on the concept of an Oddworld game without Abe as the main focus. Stranger's Wrath was focused on that of a new character, Stranger, and exploring more of Oddworld. It's now considered explaining more of Oddworld in detail. The divided reactions had it that the Xbox version of the game sold poorly once again due to Microsoft's situation. Due to the divisiveness of how the Oddworld games continued from the original two games, there was a muted reaction from developmental staff on what to do with the franchise, to return it to being that it focused on Abe, or to expand it beyond him and expand the Oddworld universe even more. During this time in 2014, Oddworld: New and Tasty was released. The Oddworld developmental team decided to bring back the Oddworld games to be focused on Abe, but a bit of nostalgia as well, because the game was a side-scrolling display much like the original two games. Reactions to the semi-reboot of the game were mixed, with critics applauding the return to focus on Abe, and yet there were claims of criticism of the game not being advertised enough for gamers to know that it had been released. The general consensus is that most gamers did want a reboot of the Oddworld franchise and a new envisioning of the original storyline. In 2016, the Oddworld developers announced that a complete reboot of the franchise was in development called Oddworld Soulstorm. Developmental problems had the game's release to be pushed to the late 2010s and even the early 2020s. From news mentioned, the focus would be that once again of Abe, and all aspects of Munch's Odyssey and Stranger's Wrath would be ignored and not considered part of the Oddworld universe. Gamers remain hopeful that the Soulstorm game would help to reinvigorate the franchise, as public statements mention gamers' frustrations that Soulstorm would be the first true Oddworld game since Exodus nearly 20 years prior. Sometimes a character can be forgotten, but mostly due to lack of interest or vision from others.